everyone. I'm Geetika Dharmasinghe. Today I'm stepping in as host for Medan Methana, loosely translated as just now and here. Medan Methana is a discussion series that engages in dialogues, in ideological and theoretical analysis of contemporary issues, or the events or the discussions that are happening in the country. Vidashana Kannangara, a social political activist, has been leading a series of conversation on these issues, and today's discussion is part of that ongoing effort. So over the past few weeks, actually, for instance, Vidashana and Professor Uyangoda have been discussing issues around the government and especially questions of democracy or radicalizing, how to radicalize democracy and the role of the opposition. Today we are continuing that conversation, but with a new voice joining us. We are very happy to welcome you, Dr. Thiru Mahendran, who lives in Jaffna, I would say, at the heartland of Tamil nationalist politics. Thiru is a lecturer at the University of Jaffna, and his work engages closely with questions of nationalism, identity politics, and identity and cultural politics, and his work and also everyday political life in the country. So more importantly, Thiru is a left liberal-leaning young political activist. Thank you, Thiru.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Thiru, for being with us. And of course, we also have Professor Jayadev Uyangoda with us. As many of you already know, he's a emeritus professor at the University of Colombo, emeritus professor of political science at the University of Colombo, and one of Sri Lanka's leading political activists or thinkers. His work has shaped how we understand ethnic conflict, peace processes, nationalism, democracy, and left politics in Sri Lanka. Earlier in his life, he was involved with the early Janata Vimukti Peramuna movement, and he was also imprisoned after the 1971 uprising. Since then, he has spent decades of thinking and writing about Sri Lankan political transformations from majoritarian politics and civil war to militarization and to populism, while consistently engaging questions of democracy and pluralism. So to begin today's conversation, we are going to focus on the current government and their engagement with the Tamil question, specifically how the government is addressing the concerns of Tamil people in the north as well as the Malayaha Tamil community. So anyway, I think like the NPP not only represents political transformation of the country that created new class alliances, but also a transformation from, like the JVP as a parent party of the NPP. So it also represents kind of like a transformation from its revolutionary past, or the violent past, to democratic win. We know the government is facing many challenges in trying to bring a systematic change, something that they promised, and after the Aragalaya, the majority of the people expected in the country a systematic change. But perhaps the more difficult, or I would say the Herculean challenge would be how it engages with the national question or the Tamil question. And the question I want to ask Professor is this a real break from the past, or is it essentially another Sinhala, kind of like Sinhala Buddhist party or a Sinhala nationalist party? Some would argue, some critics argue, or even a nationalist project in a new form.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be in this conversation, and particularly I am delighted to see Comrade Thiru, my friend Thiru from Jaffna University. And when you introduced him, you said that he comes from Jaffna, the heartland of Tamil nationalism. I must also say that it was the heartland of progressive left politics in the north.
Indeed.
So that's part of the legacy, right?
Yeah.
Even now, we could say that intellectual legacy of the left and progressive politics in the north. But to come to your question, and which is a very important question, I think there is in Sri Lanka at the moment, a conception that the JVP has always been singular nationalist, and it had a singular Buddhist nationalist perspective to what you call national question. Actually, the term national question comes from the Marxist tradition, right? It's Marx. He was talking about Ireland and nationalism in colonies, and Lenin, left parties who said the liberal political theory did not have the term national question actually, right? It's a very Marxist term, and in Sri Lanka, quite interestingly, the nationalist political project of the Tamils first articulated by the Federal Party. I think in 1949, right? The party's original manifesto. When you read it, you would be amazed to see that Federal Party's vision had socialism as well at that time. It was influenced by socialist thinking and, probably Communist Party thinking. Stalin's definition of the nation was very much there, right, in Federal Party's original document. It comes from the Communist Party's position expressed in 1943.
Yes.
The Communist Party presented it. Was, at that time, the Communist Party was a member of the Ceylon National Congress. So Communist Party's proposal to the national question, at that time actually Tamil nationalism was in a different form. They were demanding linguistic equality, not political equality in the post-independent sense. So the Communist Party advocated actually national self-determination. Even before the Tamil political parties used that phrase or that idea. So that's why I found it extremely fascinating to return to the Federal Party's original vision. And then, of course, Federal Party came out with another Stalinist formulation that Sri Lanka is a binational state. Right? There's a two nations, single nation and Tamil nation, and a single, as much as single communities and a separate nation, Tamils are a separate nation, fully using, Stalin's famous, definition of the nation.
Right.
So, we had the traditional homeland. We had this culture, thousands of years old. We have the separate area, homeland. So the point I want to say is that Tamil nationalism originally, in original formulation, had this synthesis of progressive nationalism and also socialism, right? That's very important. And it's later on actually, that changed after I think 1956. Transformation. Tamil nationalism also took much more what you call identity politics. The once again language became the key issue. And that was a response to, language-based singular, culture-based singular nationalism. Now, interestingly, both nationalism had this very strong element of cultural nationalism, religion, or singular nationalism, and so language, case of Tamil nationalism. So the JVP's, when we look at the JVP's history, JVP's original initial approach to the what you call national question came from the left tradition. But the left tradition had two standpoints. One was that, the Communist Party and Shanmugadasan's Communist parties, Beijing Wing, that tradition was there. And the LSSP tradition, it's Karala Singham, again, Tamil intellectual coming from Jaffna. He was strongly opposed to Tamil federalist demands, saying that it was a ploy to divide the working class, and he wrote this very famous pamphlet called Tamil National Question and the left position. That's probably not the exact title of that, but I think he used the expression Tamil speaking people.
Okay.
Like that. It's a very, very influential, very powerful theoretical piece. And the JVP was influenced by that argument as well.
Yeah.
Because the JVP's idea was that even you could see in the 1990, rather 2024 manifesto also, the United Sri Lanka, that comes from the left actually.
Right.
More than the singular nationalist argument. That's one. So an early period of JVP's politics did not have a strong singular nationalist line. I know it very well because I was one of the first generation members of the JVP. So then there was this notion of Indian expansionism. I have seen that even opposition politicians in parliament are accusing the current NPP, saying that you guys were advocating this line against Indian expansionism. How do you reconcile that with your current politics? But Indian expansionism, that also has a conceptual history. It was in China, China, it's Mao Zedong's politics, that political line, ideological line that invented the notion of Indian expansionism during India-China war actually, 1962-63 period. And Comrade Shanmugadasan got it from Chinese Communist Party. It was not as an anti-Tamil slogan. Even the JVP did not use Indian expansionism as an anti-Tamil slogan in Sri Lanka. But what happened, some of the sections of the JVP who were influenced by singular nationalism use it against Malayan Tamils. That's how it happens. But not the mainstream Tamil. It's rather JVP's position. Of course, JVP was also at that time, at the ground level, was a kind of a mass of young people came from various left parties, even from singular nationalist traditions. That's what happened. But I think JVP became a singular nationalist only after 1983, when the party was proscribed by the Jaya government. Before that, I remember in the late 1970s, there was a discussion within the JVP about the stand on Tamil nationalism, because that was the time when the TULF emerged. TUF first, then TULF, then famous Sansoni Commission. Probably you know that history.
Right.
Then there was this idea of national self-determination. I remember one of the policy statements of the JVP that was included. Accept the principle of national self-determination. But later they changed it. One of the reasons why they had to change it is after 1983, when the JVP was proscribed and also Indian, role in Sri Lanka, then the YPKF, their line changed. They wanted to, launch an armed struggle, patriotic armed struggle, not only against Jayajayawardena government, but also against what they call Indian invasion. So they thought that singular nationalism, not Buddhist nationalism, right? Singular nationalism was a strong, a slogan that was necessary at that time to mobilize the people against what they call the Indian imperialism and also the Jayajayawardena's very authoritarian government. So that is the stage the JVP shifted towards what we call anti-Indian as well as strongly singular nationalist line. But we must also not forget that the LSSP and CP in 1965-66 period was as singlist nationalist as anybody else actually. Under Mrs. Bandaranayaka's coalition, right? They were very very singular nationalist, 66, 67, that period. 65, 66, 67. So then my point is that the JVP's history is more complex than most people assume to think when it comes to the question of the national question. Now the JVP, what appears to me is that I am not an insider of the NPP at all, but as a political observer, I have noticed that after 1990 or that period, that's up the second JVP insurgency, and after that very, very costly, defeat that is suffered in 1988-89, there has been a new orientation of the ideology and thinking by the new leadership. The new generation of leaders emerged after 1990 period. I think probably now the JVP's leader, probably Tilwin was in among that, new group. And people like, I remember Arya Bulayagoda and others, they were also doing, a lot of, activities JVP at that time. So they were not nationalists in that sense.
So
Right?
calling them nationalist party doesn't hold, calling them a nationalist or a Sinhala Buddhist party now would
This is not, that phase is over. And that the transition period was after, I think, 1989, 1990 defeat. That was the transition period. That was also the period the new leadership shifted their strategy from armed struggle to parliamentary electoral politics.
Right.
So that was the period of actual de-radicalization of JV politics in a variety of, perspectives. So now the current position of the NPP actually not singular nationalist, but in a way reinvention of the left position, right?
Okay.
And that's why if you look at the NPP's manifesto, you could see that they have a kind of invented new language, right? They don't use the the 1990s the language of the ethnic conflict resolution, that language, or the language introduced by India, or the international state actors. No, they avoid that language. Now, if you read the NPP manifesto's last section very carefully, you could see that there is a kind of a new thinking. New thinking is, I have described it in my own terminology, to introduce an idea of a new kind of what I call civic nationalism, in which, the citizenship is the basic determinant of, inter-ethnic relations. We all are citizens with equal rights, no discrimination whatsoever, right? But within that pluralistic Sri Lankan nation, Sri Lankan state, other nationalisms can coexist. So one, nationalism, what I call ethnic nationalism, would not threaten the other ethnic nationalism. Whether it is Sinhala, Tamil, Malayaga Tamil, Muslim, they can coexist as different communities with different nationalisms, different identity, agendas, but within a larger Sri Lankan nation of citizens. So almost it's very similar to, Habermas's notion of constitutional patriotism, right? I don't think Tilwin has read Habermas, but I'm saying that it's very similar to that. You respect, your patriotism is based on the notion of citizenship, equal citizenship, pluralistic notion of citizenship. That's the thing in my reading. What is new in NPP's approach to the national question.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Thiru, given this context, I think I remember we having this, we touched on this earlier in our personal conversation and on social media, especially after President Anand Kumara's remarks at a Jaffna rally, where he said the South is ready for a change, and you also, you should support it, or you should engage with it. And some people read this as a kind of singular majoritarian statement, and he got many people criticize him. Did you also, do you also see this? See it that way? It's a kind of like a majoritarian statement, or how do you think we should understand it? In other words, I want to ask, of course, for the first time for the last 40 years, if you think about electoral politics in Sri Lanka, for the first time in history, the NPP was able to win the South without mobilizing nationalism, using nationalism, right? Mobilizing people without using nationalism. So I want to ask, what does it represent? What does this change represent for Tamil people?
Yeah, I was actually at the meeting when he was not the president, he was running for presidency, we made this statement that Tamils should embrace this narrative of change that he is representing. I found it very, it was a very arrogant statement and, very disappointing, because some of us were there expecting a different kind of message from candidate Anurag Kumara.
Right.
What I would say is that there are different narratives of change that have historically emerged from different parts of the country, from different communities. So, the demands have been different. Sometimes the demands have been, conflicting with each other. That I think that's how we have to sort of look at the whole notion of change. So, even during Aragalaya, there were demands for change, let's abolish executive presidency, let's abolish PTA, let's, create a culture where, corruption will be eliminated, and we wanted reforms, we wanted economic justice. So those demands we could hear that, in the South. In the North, there weren't many protests, only a few protests happened. But even during those protests, the change also included demands regarding devolution of power, right? And also ethnic equality. So those have been long-standing demands. I am not a fan of Tamil nationalism, but there is a vein, but still Tamils faced alienation, like Muslims, Malayaha Tamils, during the way or when the post-colonial state got formed and how it has evolved over the decades. Due to various constitutional arrangements, the colonization schemes that were happening in the north and east of the country, and the kind of anti-minority violence that was supported, aided by the state, and the language policies, then the constitutional change whereby I think Buddhism was given foremost place in the constitution, and also this sort of resistance to peace processes and there was no meaningful devolution of powers that happened. And because of those reasons, I think a different narrative of change was there within the Tamil community, and that those demands were also presented even during Aragalaya. So what I would say is, President wanted, I think, a more a homogenized narrative of change, and he was trying to sort of impose the narrative of change that was emerging from the South on the people of the North, and he wanted everybody to sort of embrace that change. I think many of the things that emerged from the narrative about change that came from the South were also supported by people in the North, and still supported. Everybody wants a corruption-free culture. Everybody wants economic justice, right? And everybody is keen that we have to invest in the free healthcare and free education systems of our country, right? So on those fronts, I think there is a lot of common ground. But the North also had other demands, and these are historical demands, right? Whether you agree with Tamil nationalism or not, these have been there, right? And I think his narrative didn't really include those demands during the presidential campaign. So that's why I think people found it a bit they thought it was a very arrogant statement. But I think he did change his narrative a little bit when he came for the parliamentary election campaign. And there are I think he, again, not much, but he at least mentioned something about land and releasing political prisoners or something, a little certain things. He said there are differences in the North, right? He touched on those issues. I think the larger question, again, relating to what Professor Oyangoda said, about this civic citizenship, I think, which is a very interesting idea, and I think the NPP is, to some extent, I think, interested in that idea also. That's what I see. But for that to happen, I think we have to also look at the way the state was progressively Sinhala Buddhicized in our history, right? Whether the JVP was a party to that process or not, but others have done that, and the JVP also contributed to it, as Professor Oyangoda said, during certain phases. And we also, like I was an undergraduate at the University of Peradeniya between 2005 and 2009. And the student unions were fully controlled by the JVP, and they were like basically warmongering, right? And they saw the peace process as a threat to the country's sovereignty, and they were also very dishonest in conflating the minority question and the minority grievances with NGOization and international intervention. Like, if you locally address these problems, you don't need NGOs and the international actors to come in and intervene in this process. Of course, they were taking advantage of the situation in the country and using it for their own economic and political agendas. But again, those issues could have been easily addressed, and there was a peace process that was underway. And there were certain things that President Kumaratunga tried, and certain things that Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe tried. But the JVP, they very consciously they aligned with Mahinda Rajapaksa along with JHU, and they played a major role in bringing him to power in 2005. So, of course, the LTT's boycott also contributed to that process. So, but the JVP's role is, I think, that's when I saw the JVP in its really the real Sinhala nationalist face of the JVP staring at your face at the university, right? And there were constantly demonstrations, and the Tamil students were always on the periphery. So it was and they were, the way they were trying to stop the post-tsunami rehabilitation mechanism, there was some agreement that the government was going to sign with the LTT to bring relief to the tsunami affected areas in the north and the east, and they were very much staunchly opposed to it, and they were launching satyagrahas near the university. So all those things were happening. So they know that the state was being Sinhala Buddhized during the post-independence era, and they also contributed to that process. And suddenly, when you want to create this sort of a civic nationalism, which is an interesting idea, I am not rejecting it, or I don't see that as useless. But for that, I think, first of all, you have to also address how you were complicit in these processes. Number two, you can't bring about this sort of a civic nationalism overnight, and without really de-Sinhala Buddhizing the state, right? So there are these structures that are so entrenched, so embedded in the state. So constitutionally, otherwise, you have to sort of address them, right? If you look at even it's a big issue in the north, but a very specific issue, say land, right? The way, Tamil people and Muslims lost their lands in this country are very, very much connected to the majoritarian Sinhala Buddhization project that has been happening in the country for a very long time. So it would have been done through the Mahavali Authority, maybe it would have been done through the Archaeology Department, Wildlife Department, maybe governments within which JVP had no place, but by the other governments. So people lost their land mainly because of this sort of Sinhala Buddhization process, and I think there was a very conscious agenda by certain governments, both the SLFP-led governments and the UNP-led governments, that we have to somehow change the demography of the north and the east, the cultural landscape of the north and the east, because this is a region where the Sinhalese are not the majority community. So there was a systematic way in which the landscape and the demography was being changed. And that for me is a Sinhala Buddhization project, and that has been happening for a long time in the guise of development, in the guise of wildlife preservation, in the guise of archaeological research, right? Yeah. So then you have to also then, give back the land to those people, right? And address their concerns. I'm not talking about the Tamils alone, but the Muslims also, who were evicted by the LTT, then they were trying to resettle in these areas, and they were not properly supported by successive governments. So those things actually didn't really happen. And even when I think some members of the government knew that, like, what happened with regard to land was all wrong, they were not very willing to challenge the Buddhist establishment in the country. For instance, in the Thayiti Buddhist temple issue, like, I think everybody agrees that this land belongs to the people, and this was during the militarized period. It was given to a Buddhist monk, and then he illegally constructed this Buddhist temple, and the people's land should be returned to them. But I think there is no will. Even when President came to Jaffna, I think last time or last year, or early this year, I can't remember now, I think early this year, he was like blaming both groups, right? There are like Buddhist priests or Buddhists coming, like, passing the Jayasri Mahabodhi and coming to Jaffna and spreading hatred. And then the Tamil protesters were also spreading. I think both statements were very wrong. I think Buddhists came there, like, they go to Nagadeepa, they worship, like, sometimes Tamils come here in the south to worship Kataragama or something. And then the protesters were actually demanding their lands. Of course, they are supported by Tamil nationalist politicians who may have their own agendas and political positions. But in the end of the day, like, it's the people's lands, and the people are struggling for their lands, right? So for me, like, bringing about those changes, like releasing land, implementing the language policy properly, right? And also building the regional economies, like, supporting the regions and the institutions in the region. Like, for instance, the university where I teach is really understaffed, the arts faculty, right? So, like, those are the ways in which I think you would show that you are committed to de-Sinhala Buddhizing the state, or you are committed to building a civic nationalism, right? Or a civic citizenship-based nationalism where everybody will be treated equally. So that idea is good, but I feel that the current government doesn't have the political will to do that, even if they may be interested personally, right? Like, they are not like really using like, Sinhala Buddhist nationalism to create divisions in a very overt way. But the past injustices they don't really want to address, and then they are also very careful that they don't antagonize the majority community. I think the Polity editorial was very telling, like, they said this government is like, they are governing in the anticipation of backlash, right? Like, so like, so you make decisions
based on
like,
assumption.
based on assumptions, and this will happen. This particular community or the Buddhist monks will be opposing this. Like, even other things like, corporal punishment, for instance, right? When the opposition came from the Buddhist establishment, they took a step back. And also when it comes to reforms related to the LGBT community, again, opposition came from the Buddhist establishment. So because of their inability to tackle Buddhist nationalism head on, right? I think that's where their idea of civic nationalism doesn't doesn't become any of a dynamic kind of process, right? It remains an idea, right? Like, it doesn't take off and develop, right? So that is what I feel. So I think it is like, so the change narrative, I think, should give a prominent place to de-Sinhala Buddhizing the state. That has to happen, and the JVP has to accept that the state has become very Sinhala Buddhist over the decades, right? Yeah.
Right. So, Professor, like you mentioned this idea of civic citizenship. Again, like I'm going back to the first question. In a way, like, so this government especially has been criticized because of history, that I call this original thing or historical things associated with it. It's past as a leftist movement, right? Like, for instance, or for example, the position of their position during the war at certain moments, and they argue. Their critiques are arguing that we can expect much from this government, or in terms of having a political solution, or they're not thinking about Tamil question. So, do you think this is a kind of a fair criticism, or it's more of an elite framing of the past?
Yeah. There are a couple of issues that I wanted to actually comment on in what, it's a very
Thiru was
detailed
saying.
response that you gave me. You see, at one level, you can interpret the civic nationalist project, although the NPP doesn't use it. That's my own characterization of it. It's a project without substance. No, it's a narrative without a policy substance. That you were saying.
Right.
I think that's an important criticism. I don't, reject that criticism. It's an important criticism. The criticisms are very necessary. You see, there is, I don't know whether, that kind of a discussion is taking place within the government or within the NPP. I don't know. But if it doesn't, that kind of a critical discourse, critical conversation doesn't happen within the government, within the NPP. I think it has to come from people like us who are actually, let's say, friends of the government, right? It has to come.
Right.
That critical discourse is extremely important. Now, to put it, what your point in a different language, I think some of your colleagues are making this point, the NPP doesn't recognize the agential role of the Tamils in the north, right? Agency, government is denying the agency, saying that the president, NPP goes to Jaffna and tell them this is what we should be doing. I think that I can very well understand that reaction. But at the same time, there are two challenges for any government, except a revolutionary government which has come to power through a revolution. Demilitarization of the Sri Lankan state, de-ethnicization of the Sri Lankan state. You use the term single Buddhicization, the same thing. And that, both the Buddhicization of the state, Sri Lankan state, or ethnicization of Sri Lankan state, and militarization of the state has taken place how many decades now? Since actually 1970s. Militarization of the state started since 1971. Right? And Buddhicization started in the mid-1950s. All communalized, you can use, I think, Shanmuganathan, our old friend, Comrade Shanmuganathan, who is in Norway now. He used the term communalization of the state. I remember he wrote an article in a journal, VSSA published Polity. Decommunalization of the state he says a fundamental precondition for a successful transition to war, to peace. So these are, my point is, these are long-term projects. No government, except a revolutionary government, can do it. But that it's a hugely challenging process. Right? So I think that conversation has to begin. At some level, if it does not come from the president or the government, from the NPP, that conversation is necessary. That's one. Secondly, now the NPP's policy also something like this. This threatens the traditional Tamil political parties. It threatens the traditional political leaders who come from the upper class and upper caste elites, right? So there's a certain feeling of unease, right? Discomfort and being challenged, right, by what they call a political party coming from the south, right? And that was very much, I remember, during the local government election campaign, that idea was there in Jaffna amongst Tamil nationalists. So obviously that reaction you have to expect, because Tamil society's political imagination has been primarily defined, dictated, and even verbalized by the elites, by lawyers, very, very good lawyers. Even now, that's the case, actually. So, I think the NPP's intervention in Jaffna tries to transfer that monopoly of defining the terms of the discourse from the elites to, I would say, subordinate social classes, intelligentsia, and political activists that have come from the subordinate social classes. So consciously or unconsciously, NPP has set in motion in the north kind of a slow process of Aragale. The Aragale took place in Colombo, primarily Sinhalese society. It in a way dethroned traditional elites, right? That is the political space that enabled the NPP also to come into power. That kind of an Aragale hasn't taken place either in a Sinhala or rather Tamil or Muslim societies. But it's taking place among the Malaya Tamil community. But the CWC's leadership is now under threat. Right?
Yeah.
But it can happen in the north also. But I think the NPP has to be careful, to be conscious of the kind of dangers that you were referring to. NPP should not appear to be dictate in terms to the way the Tamil political imagination should be conceptualized.
Yeah.
So then it has to come from the intellectuals, new generation of intellectuals who are from this newly mobilized social groups, intellectuals. I don't know about Jaffna University produces that kind of, because the political imagination has been for decades dominated and defined by one specific discourse. National emancipation discourse, not social emancipation discourse. What I find extremely important that I welcome is that the NPP is trying to fuse or synthesize the narrative of national emancipation and goals and expectations of nation, right? And also the social class, social justice, equality, and the
collective
Jaffna
rights.
has a very large population of poor people, coming from Dalit caste communities, working class, unemployed. So how, to my knowledge, except the first Federal Party manifesto, the question of social justice, in that social justice was referred to indirectly. But Tamil nationalist politics has not brought the idea of social justice, social equality to the center of its political vision, right? That is one of the problems. So when the political party from the south raises it, you see, the kind of the questions, challenges that you refer, it happens. But there's a challenge that NPP has to face. There's a class solidarity. There's the national politics. If the NPP doesn't have a nationalist approach to Sri Lankan politics, if the Tamil political parties in the north have a nationalist approach to politics, then of course the two will have to have some kind of negotiation. So unfortunately, the Tamil political leadership thinks that only negotiations that they should enter into government is about a new constitution, what to do with 13th Amendment, what to do with the provincial council. My argument is not adequate. If they can also bring in this idea of, bringing together, ethnic emancipation and social emancipation as political goals, I think then it opens up a new space for negotiation. You see, the negotiations between Tamil political leadership and the single political leadership and Muslim political leadership, we should not forget that also, should not be confined to the imaginations of the 1990s and after, right? All the political imagination at that time were defined by the political interests of Tamil elites, Muslim elites, and Sinhala elites, right? So how to handle these, challenges of the new historical space? And Sri Lanka is also now in a phase after the defeat of the LTT, rightly or wrongly, a phase which I call post-secessionist phase. This secessionist politics, in a way, enabled extreme Tamil nationalism to sustain itself, and extreme Sinhala Buddhist nationalism also to sustain itself. So now we don't have that historical limit. There's a new historical space where the decommunalization of not only the state, but all forms of politics in Sri Lanka are also tackled in a way that kind of communalism is actually think of the past.
I think, yes, it's true. We have all these expectations, and we think there is a possibility to imagine a new society where people think about not rather like national emancipation, but the social emancipation. So I also want to ask Thiru, there has been a discussion on, of course, about the JVP-led NPP winning 3 parliamentary seats in Jaffna. So the question is like, some people argue this is a kind of a failure, right? And because like they didn't, as you mentioned also, they didn't represent the change that the people in the north wanted or have been asking for so long, while others see it as a sign of broader, I would say, kind of political shift and a collective sense of optimism. Following a major national kind of like transformation or a change, right? So how do you read these 2 narratives? Especially I want to ask in terms of elite and non-elite political perspectives in Jaffna and more broadly across the country.
Yeah, I think this is where like I again feel that even the social justice agenda, the social justice sort of framing, I feel the NPP is also not really using that language very strongly. I don't know, maybe they are still part of the IMF-driven economic reform package, and they are unable to do anything, like, they are stuck and they are unable to imagine a different kind of economic order which challenges neoliberalism. So even that narrative of social justice and bringing the non-elite to the center, they are not I don't see them like really using that language also in a very political sense. Even in the north, I feel it's more like they are trying to manage everybody, right? And there is a certain opening where I think the non-elite forces can kind of come through the JVP or NPP, and they are able to sort of claim a certain kind of political space in the north because of the opening created by this sort of change, which is maybe true. But on the whole, I would say they have to also go back to the central values of left politics, I think, as a whole, not just about ethnicity, but also class, right? And to what extent are they using that language of class and class solidarity and fighting neoliberalism, right? And thinking about even reforms, even educational reforms. To what extent they give priority to social justice in framing our education. It's all kind of still, I feel, very much connected to the neoliberal agendas and international financial organizations like the World Bank, and their vision seems to still dominate. So that's where I feel, again, we need a similar critique, right? Holding them accountable, and also the way, look at cost of living, for instance. It is still very high. Right, and electricity prices have gone up, fuel prices have gone up, and because of that situation, even the poor, the non-elite segments of the Tamil community, which viewed the arrival of the NPP with a certain kind of optimism, now feel a bit tired, right? Nothing is happening, right? In the corruption front also, people have questions, right? The way the minister was, it took some time for him to resign the energy, right?
Yeah.
So people are asking those questions, and also institutional reforms, right? Why is there a delay? Abolishing PTA, why there is a delay? Abolishing executive presidency, we don't see any move happening, right? So these are issues where the north and south agree on, right? A lot of consensus exists around these issues, but still I think the government is not doing much to sort of take forward these reforms, right? And as a result, again, the non-elite Tamils feeling hopeful. I don't know to what extent that's going to last, right? And then with a certain kind of nationalist consolidation that may emerge with growing disenchantment in the south. Let's say, like, the government is not really bringing about economic transformation in the lives of the rural communities or the poor, the working class communities in the south, then that will be, used as an opportunity by, the Sinhala nationalist forces to come back to power, right? And the economic grievances are the ones that would be used to remobilize Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, right? And when that happens, like in the north also, there is a possibility that, Tamil nationalism may become even more powerful, right? So for me, I think, yes, there is a way in which I think the NPP seems to build its local constituencies, local party infrastructure, and trying to get the support of the non-elite. But still, did they really address class and caste-based issues in the north? I feel they haven't done much. And caste, for instance, I think, you have to also use that language and talk about it, and and like ethnicity, they wouldn't touch that. They would just try to say, we are for a socially, equal society, right? But they won't, offer a class critique or offer a critique of neoliberalism, right? I think those are the areas where I think there should be, we have to push the government in that direction and tell them to sort of, recommit to your own, vision of social justice. You have had a long tradition, even though ethnic issues the JVP might have been changing its position and not really clear, but at least issues like class, right? They have to be, they have to talk about those issues and think about the welfare of the working people and the cost of living crisis that the country is going through now. So it's only then, I think, the peripheral communities in the northeast will also see this government as a different kind of government, right? So when you came with this narrative about change, which in certain ways resonated with the people in the north, right? Like your anti-corruption agenda, your commitment to institutional reforms. But now we feel that none of this is happening, right? So, so I still feel if this government fails, I think we are faced with a major nationalist onslaught, right? And that is what will happen. But I also see that they are squandering an opportunity that people created, right? And why are they not doing anything? And why are they still going in this sort of a neoliberal track and not really addressing issues that they championed earlier, like the abolition of PTA, for instance, right? So you have to keep pushing this government on those fronts to do something meaningful.
Yeah. I think so it seems that we are agreeing that we have to think of a kind of new language of thinking about this social emancipation, and we are lacking it, right? We have to think about. So I want to ask, especially, this is an old question, so younger for you. I don't mind. I hope you don't mind answering it. It concerns the nature of our democracy. Again, which you have previously described as authoritarian kind of constitutionalism. The NPP also, as Thiru also mentioned, has introduced PSTA while also promising, so they were promising all alone, they're going to abolish or repeal the PTA, which many of us see as another kind of a draconian law, and they have been using it to label all of us, those who are against or resist the government, as terrorists. And so because of it seems that they have, or they don't have a proper language, and they are using the same rhetoric, so same kind of even to bring something, an act like this, PSTA. I want to ask, are they does this suggest that how do I say, they are operating within the same old structures or the same old languages, right? And can we realistically expect something new, or like can they actually bring a change?
It's a difficult question to answer. I need to think a little bit about the final question. Said I'll come to that later.
Right,
therefore.
right.
You see, some of the dilemmas the NPP government is facing, as a government that promised not only to the people but to itself to be a transformative government. Right? Now, even the discourse of transformation is very interesting. Now, the transformation is something that's between reform and revolution. You see, the NPP is not a reformist government in the sense that, previous PA government or, or Bandaranaike government. No, it's not reformist. We are beyond that. At the same time, NPP did not want to say that it's a revolutionary government, right? So the transformation metaphor, when you deconstruct it politically, it's an interesting metaphor. Right? They don't want to be adventurous to be a revolutionary government. They don't want to be just reformist to be a reformist. So they are in a kind of a dilemma is created by themselves, right? So your point is that now 1.5 years in power, right? What are the signs of transformation? Transformative agenda this government is pursuing. Now I think the biggest barrier to that is the economic crisis. So government has no other option but to continue with the IMF agenda. And the government also has a fundamentally very, very challenging agenda. That is, they have to work within the capitalist framework, and this is a capitalist economy. And this Sri Lankan economy is a capitalist economy in deep crisis. So managing that is such a complex task that the government has disappointed not only all the voters but also people like us, and particularly the working class, the middle classes who constitute the core of the NPP electoral base. So government has to be very, very mindful of the volatility of the Sri Lankan electorate. If they realize that this government is also like previous political governments, they give promises and they don't
honor them.
They don't meet the promises. The Sri Lankan people are unforgiving in
Punishing.
punishing, right? Electorally. Actually, they have to be very, very careful about it. You can't blame the people. People are intelligent and they are actually political decisions largely defined by what their stomach tells them, So the IMF agenda is a huge obstacle to government's economic and social transformation agenda. And you were talking about social justice, demands of the people. Actually, the last budget that the president gave this, the economic package, that's actually he has been doing in some way to do that. It's not adequate. Even this, 1,000 rupee day, this salary, other allowance to the Malayalam Tamil community. It's another of those, right? Without using the language of social justice. What I see is that the government is forced to do certain little things. In substance, it's social justice, but they don't use the terminology. That's for a variety of reasons. I think one of the main reasons is that this government's capacity for conceptualizing what it thinks and what it does is limited. That's one thing I have noticed, right? They don't conceptualize what they do. Even this idea of, say, the new kind of civic nationalism, they should have done that. I hope they accept
Communication seems zero, no? Like they're not communicating well, or like they're not telling what they are doing.
Exactly, that is also there. I think communication with the citizens is rather weak. Communication with the society is also weak. President is a great communicator, right? I think President is the only person who communicates with the
Communicated.
people from the government, right? Presidential system unfortunately has that weakness,
Yeah.
It creates the president to be the only communicator like all previous government. I think this government has to be little careful to sustain the kind of ideological and political change that they initiated in the year 2024. And in the space opened up by the Aragalaya.
Yeah.
You see, if this government does not fulfill expectations, political, social, economic expectations expressed during and after Aragalaya, actually government will be in serious trouble. So those are the things we have to actually publicly discuss now. Unfortunately, our opposition doesn't, it's not their duty now. They will certainly not have a duty. We are, any opportunity opened up before us to grab power, we will do that.
Yeah.
But you can't expect it from the parliamentary opposition, any opposition. Even British parliament opposition is like that. But we have to have a critical discourse. Social media, I don't know, I am not a social media follower. Whether there is a conversation with the NPP supporters, this kind of, conversation. I think government has to start its own,
Platforms or something.
public, communication with the citizens, communication with the electors, communication with the voters, communication with the intelligentsia, right? That gap in communication will cost government a little bit.
Yeah.
So you worry about the the resurgence of extreme nationalism in Tamil, Muslim and Sinhala societies. I don't think it will happen, but nevertheless we can't exclude the possibility. We should always think about that, right? Then the other question is something like that you pose. I think it's very important for us to reflect on that. What is the government capacity to implement its own transformative agenda? And you are raising that question. And the government will have to seriously think about that as well. And the opposition criticism is that government does have that capacity, right? You have the emotional capacity, but you have to have the intellectual and policy capacity as well. So some of the challenges government has been facing during the past 6 months very clearly indicate that government has to seriously think about building its own capacity in governance.
I think, there are two things, two related points. One,
so
I feel...
Before you complete the answer, Thiru, I want to also ask your position on these draconian laws and bringing the PSTA. And I want you to reflect on some of these authoritarian patterns that they seem to be following, which might ultimately undermine the expectations of the Tamil people or the Tamil community. So there is also a broader kind of you see like reluctance to fully repeal the existing forms of these laws, and I want to reflect to reflect on those.
Sure,
also.
I would come to that. So before that, I think as Professor Oyangoda said about the capacity, right? I feel that they are not really utilizing, people with the sort of capacity, intellectual resources, right, to the maximum in bringing about reforms. And one reason I think they also don't seem to trust even left-wing intellectuals, right? I feel during the educational reforms process, this is a government which could have tapped all the intellectuals who could think about let's take these humanities and social sciences very differently, very radically, make students think differently about our history and our cultures. But I didn't see that kind of interest emerging from this government. It was very disappointing, right? And in India, we have heard about how people like Romila Thapar and others were involved in these textbook writing processes and how they were able to sort of create a certain kind of a secular imaginary and think about their country's past differently, right? All of that, and I thought this is our moment and we could have done all those things. But again, that didn't really happen. It was really disappointing. And then I also feel sometimes the NPP supporters are not online spaces. They don't welcome criticism, they become very defensive, right? They don't know who their allies are sometimes, right? Like, when the NPP is asked to recommit to its own leftist principles, like, they face, like, the ones who offer that critique face a lot of attacks. So those things also, I think, should go. So those are the two related points that I wanted to make. And then I also felt like the other issue, like, the in the north, the creation of Praja Shakti, for instance, like, these alternative political bodies or whatever to take care of local government initiatives also causes worry. Like, why we have a local government system, and why not strengthen it? Why not make it more democratic? Whereas this is more like a party-oriented system, where the party seems to be appointing people who would run like a parallel mechanism. And these Praja Shakti members will have a lot of say in the district development council meetings and in making decisions regarding development. So in a situation where the local government body is controlled by the NPP, and then the Praja Shakti is there, I think they can coordinate. But in the north, it's also different. There are elected bodies where the Tamil parties are heading the local government bodies. And then the Praja Shakti members are seen as creating some kind of interference. And people are also worried whether we are heading towards a more dictatorship kind of thing, or a one-party system, right? Those fears are all being discussed. So I think the government has to also think about it. Like, we have to commit to a more parliamentary left-wing kind of democracy, right? That is very important. And it's also, at some point, I think they have to realize, like, it's okay to lose elections for principles, right? Like, because you need a force that may sometimes lose an election, but they can come back and do good things. Like, we need, like, a strong alternative force that can also be sustained, right? Like, and everybody becomes a nationalist force. What are we going to do? Like, whom are we going to turn to for change, right? So those are things that we have to consider. And then to respond to your question about the laws, right? I think the JVP, their original position is, like, they don't want a replacement for PTA, right? And then now they are introducing it, right? This is again, like, and we know how PTA was used initially. Even before it was used against Tamils, I think it was used against workers by the J.R. Jayawardena government, and, like, the workers who were engaged in trade union action. So it was a draconian law which is also against working class communities. And later it was used against Tamils, then Muslims, and then during Aragalaya, political activists from the Sinhala community also targeted. Right. So why does the government want to introduce such a law? Like, are they thinking that, like, there will be opposition to them, and whether they are going to use this law again against dissenters, right? So if you want to build a democracy, I don't think you need laws of this kind. There are other systems, other mechanisms that are available, and you have to sort of, allow those mechanisms to run the course, right? Like, so that is what I think the approach should be. So I think the government should allay these fears also, like, we are not going in the direction of authoritarianism. That's why everybody is asking, like, what is happening to the executive presidency, right? Which is also, like, I feel like, if we miss this opportunity, I don't know when we will be able to do that, right? That also has to happen. That was an issue of which, like, there was a lot of consensus in the country, right? PTA is also like that, right? I don't think the Sinhala Buddhist community is, like, demanding the restoration of PTA or creating another alternative law or anything like that. Like, who is behind it? Like, which constituency is demanding this? I don't see anybody except the government, right? So these are issues, I think, where we have to continuously raise our voice and hold the government accountable. I don't know whether we will be successful, but they enjoy 2/3 majority in the House. So use that majority to bring about progressive changes, institutional reforms, make the system more transparent, make the system more democratic, right? Introduce stringent anti-corruption laws maybe, right? Like, why not these Why are you introducing these things, right? Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So, Professor, I want to ask, reflecting on this, like thinking about certain mechanisms to address the issues facing Tamil community and in general the working class community. So you have spoken about the need for administrative decentralization in addressing the Tamil question, for instance. And many of us also share that view. But more recently, you have also suggested a shift in how we think about solutions. So you have argued that we may need to move beyond familiar terms like devolution and that we may or develop a new political vocabulary, especially one that allows for meaningful dialogue and opens up possibilities for a constitutional settlements or settlement beyond the limits of the current framework, right? And toward a kind of like deepening the democracy. So, but with the NPP now in power, so the discussion seems to be limited to provincial council, and of course there are many, so we are asking them to find new mechanisms, but there seems like there's not even a serious engagement with or the discussion with the 13th Amendment, if we are thinking about it still. And some argue that it is because JVP represents a Sinhala Buddhist constituency, and that they are generally opposed, the Sinhala Buddhist constituencies generally oppose devolution, therefore we don't need to, or they think that don't need to think about it. So, and I want to ask in this context, what would you suggest those who are concerned about the Tamil question, and also, I especially want to ask this shift in your thinking about finding new vocabularies, and then not, or the new language to think about solution for the Tamil question. And I'm asking in terms of this mechanism, certain ways of, yeah.
To start with your last point, actually, on the language question, there is nothing new for this government to do in terms of legislation.
So
Right,
there
right.
are.
It's constitutional, it's a very good language rights constitution we have. You have the laws, Official Languages Commission. But look at the Official Languages Commission reports for the past 25 years. Every annual report would say, no government had the political will to implement the provisions fully and comprehensively. No resources, no capacities, right? No translators.
Yeah.
Always there's the excuse.
Yeah.
And I hope that's not the excuse of this government as well. Right? I know in the Colombo University, we did a study some time ago in our department about this foreign language policy. International Center for Ethnic Studies did this studies. There are so many studies on this question, and with very good recommendations. Unfortunately, NPP government's leadership does not seem to be aware of this kind of discourse that has taken place in Sri Lanka about how to implement this very good set of laws on the official language, right? Yeah, properly implement. Actually, it's a question of resources. It's a question of political will, right? So those things have to be addressed, right? And the government has to learn a lot from the kind of democratizing political discourses and democratic revolutions to the ethnic conflict and national question that have taken place in our society. And you were telling us about this conversation that has been in the northern society. The government has to be aware of it, actually. As you said, there are a lot of people who are friends of the government who are actually who have been taking part in these conversations for decades. But the government should tap those intellectual resources, actually. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be happening. But I can say some contrasting examples, and it's not a good example, but just example. Mr. Premadasa, when he was the president, say how Susil Siriwadana advised Mr. Premadasa, and so they accepted this, participatory decision making in housing, right? Susil Siriwadana was the friend of mine and a very senior civil servant. into this idea of participatory development policies. Right? The government immediately accepted it and appointed him to the position of the chairman of the National Housing, this commission or housing authority. But this government don't seem to be doing that. The government has to genuinely accept that within the party and within the government, within the bureaucracy now, there is a kind of shortage of new imaginations, new ideas. So governments, when you look at the government's NPP manifesto, it's full of new imaginations. It's full of new ideas, right? On the question, I give you an example on the question of devolution and decentralization. The last sections of this chapter 4 of it, I think last paragraph probably, says that they want to devolve powers to provinces, districts, and division, local bodies. So that means, and they want to strengthen not only provincial councils, but also bring it down. Actually, in other words, that particular imagination comes from the subsidiarity principle. Right? Subsidiarity principle says that in the local government, you strengthen the local, lowest possible unit of the local government system so that people have greater participation. And you brought the example of you also Praja Shakti. I think Praja Shakti program had the potential, to develop and introduce to Sri Lanka two new principles of democratic governance. What is participatory development, participatory local governance, local self-governance. But to do that, as you very correctly pointed out, the local committees that are set up should be either half elected, half nominated. Instead that all these members of this, I don't exactly remember the term it's used in the law, is I think probably the local committee, right? Praja committee or something. It's all members are appointed, these are party members. But the justification from the government is that, the corruption in the local level development matters is a big issue. Even the local government institutions. So elected representatives, all of them might not. They are also corrupt from political parties. They want to avoid local level development corruption. But it has to combine local development with local democracy. That's why I have always been talking about new vocabulary. That there's a local democracy, local self-governance. These are kind of concepts that can ignite, political imagination of citizens also. Gramiya Swayam Palane, Gramiya Prajatantravad, local democracy, instead of federalism. I remember I was working with this constitutional expert, Yash Ghai, was a Kenyan of Indian origin, one of the experts in constitutional drafting in conflict divided societies. So he said in Colombo that if you want to draft a democratic constitution for an ethnically divided society, please avoid the language that further divides the people. Right? So word federalism is very attractive to political leaders in Jaffna. But it's the term that has divided Sinhala and Tamil people for decades, right? So we have to abandon that term. Instead, I like to propose a term like power sharing. Multi-level power sharing. At the provincial level, district level, Pradesh Sabha level, community level like panchayats in India, government can introduce actually a smaller local government units, very similar to panchayat. India's panchayat has empowered a lot of women for local governance. So there are a lot of things actually available. You don't have to reinvent those things. They are already in our political democratic conversation. Actually, Sri Lanka has a Sri Lankan society, Tamil society, Sinhalese society, Muslim society, the Malaga Tamil communities. When you go and listen to them, I have been talking to people like my students in the university, my academic colleagues. I realize that all our societies have developed extremely rich concepts and ideas for deeper democratization in our society. But we don't have access to them. No, we don't take them seriously. So that's why, the traditional political vocabulary is probably not adequate. I don't say that we have to totally abandon. But there's a lot of things that have come from our own people. They are actually homegrown political democratic imaginaries in our society. That is the task of the post-Aragalaya, any progressive government in Sri Lanka. And the NPP should be told that they have a historical responsibility to carry forward the mandate that Aragalaya gave to, new political leaderships. That's very important. Still we don't have an adequate conversation about what we have learned from Aragalaya 2022 about democratization. What kind of democracy? Is it the whole liberal parliamentary democracy, British Westminster democracy? No, look at the name of our constitution. Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. It's not only liberal democracy. It has socialism or social democracy. Then Republican democracy is inherent in the official name of our state. So those are the openings for, fresh imaginaries, fresh imaginations, right? Then we can deepen our political vocabulary in such a way that our political terminologies will no longer divide people, but bring all of them together as citizens.
I also
citizens.
want to ask you, Professor, the whole idea, you have been supported this idea or the term like Tamil self-determination, right? So you're saying that we need to change this or find a new vocabulary. And somewhere you also mentioned we need, like, rather than focusing on these old kind of language, we need to have a kind of a revised left position on these issues. Before I move to Thiru, I want you to say something or reflect on that idea. What is this, having this kind of like left-leaning government in power? What could be the left or this revised left position when it comes to addressing the Tamil question?
I won't call this government as a left government. It's a progressive government.
Yeah.
You see,
not even left.
I have a feeling that when I read the NPP manifesto, it perhaps deliberately avoids left political vocabulary.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a deliberate thing, I think.
Right.
So that's why it is not it's not a liberal democratic vocabulary either. It's not a socialist left vocabulary either. It's something, actually that's why I said even this morning I read it before coming to this discussion, I thought there are a lot of fascinating fresh ideas. But I don't think government ministers, MPs have read that manifesto. Right? I hope they will read it carefully and there will be workshops, to explain. There are a lot of fresh ideas.
For them to understand.
They have to. The problem is for the traditional political parties, they are used to traditional liberal terminology, right?
Yeah.
Liberal democratic terminology. And the left people are used to traditional left terminology. It's not either. That is something very innovative. I don't know who drafted it, but it's an innovative manifesto. But I hope that, that rereading that manifesto enable us to identify one strand of homegrown democratic thinking. There are so many other strands, feminist strand of political thinking in Sri Lanka, Republican, communitarian, and also minority political discourse, right? Liberal, procedural democracy is totally inadequate to accommodate, minority, so-called minority, I don't like to use that word, that ethnic self-determination demands. With self-determination demand, in political theory, political philosophy, is a collective communitarian demand, not individual rights demand. So the NPP has got an opportunity actually to redefine the even constitutional discourse in Sri Lanka. Our constitutional discourse has remained far too long a prisoner of British unitary state constitutional discourse.
Yeah, Thiru, given all this, given all this context, what do you think we can realistically expect from this government in relation to long-standing Tamil demands, including the self-determination, of course? Professor is asking us to find a new vocabulary. So do you think, especially identity-based politics, is still holds relevance? Or are there limits to it in the current context, especially given the NPP's rise and the level of support it has received from the Tamil voters? And I want you to also tell us about what are the expectations of the Tamil people, and then how are we going to achieve them under this government?
I feel with regard to the NPP's victory in the parliamentary elections, I think, right? Tamils have also been voting for pro-southern kind of political parties earlier too, right? Douglas Devananda used to get a lot of significant votes, and then Angaj and Ramanathan would get some votes, Vijaya Kala Maheswaran would get some votes. They were kind of either members of one of the major national parties from the south or an ally of those parties, right? So it's also possible, those votes also shifted towards the NPP. But I do agree that, a segment of the Tamil nationalist votes shifted towards the NPP. There is no question about that, right? I think that may be because for the first time, a segment of the Tamil community saw a national party which was not overtly using the divisive rhetoric of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, which is a key change, I think, which we have to accept. And we have to see how we can build on that, right? So that is something that we have to think about. But as for these long-standing demands, I am kind of very disillusioned with this whole idea of self-determination. I even feel like Lenin and all these people were in a way normalized something that is very problematic by using that language, because each territory belongs to a particular nation, and now we have decolonial thinkers like Mahmood Mamdani and Nandita Sharma and others who have offered very convincing critiques of the whole left ideas about self-determination, and how left, liberals, fascists, everybody was in some way or the other contributing to this sort of national consolidation, which is dangerous, right? There were cycles of violence and genocide that we have seen. There is the Murli Vaikal genocide, but then another horrendous form of violence was the ethnic cleansing of the Muslims from 1990 by the LTTE, even as they were trying to form a separate Tamil state, right? So for me, this constitutionalizing a particular nation within a given territory and calling it self-determination, I find it a very I'm kind of not very interested and quite disillusioned with that idea, because it has led to cycles of violence and othering. But at the same time, there is also something else that I feel very strongly about with regard to the state and its relationship to the Tamils, especially Tamils in the north and the Muslims in the north and the east. The way in which the state is trying to minoritize them, trying to make them politically and culturally weaker in areas where they where they form the majority. That's how I understand the north and the east. Now, I don't think whether there is a merged north and the east is also possible, because the Tamils and Muslims also have their own divisions, and the Muslims are the majority community now in the eastern province. Whether they would support the idea of a merged northeast, that also I'm not very sure. Although one could work towards that ideal, right? But I feel that in these areas, land remains a very contentious issue, right? It is as I said earlier, all these various apparatuses of the state are used to grab Tamil and Muslim people's land and to settle people from the south, Sinhalese, in those areas. Sometimes in areas like Velioya, Tamil people's lands were taken away from them, and then the Sinhalese were settled there. It's kind of a very settler colonial, if you look at that situation. If you like in that particular instance. There are other ways in which land grab is happening, right, in these areas. So things like that have happened. So there is the worry that, like, whether the Tamils and Muslims will be minoritized even in these regions. They are already minority if you look at the larger picture, right? So that's where I think we have to keep pushing for devolution of at least land powers to these regions in such a way those land powers cannot be taken back by the central government, right? So that is a very important demand for me. For me, that is a non-negotiable demand, right? And I think, like, that, and once I think land powers are properly devolved, I think a lot of tension that we now see between the different communities will also at least reduce, I feel, right? And I'm also very much, I also want to talk about, like, the land relations within these provinces. Like, if you look at Batticaloa district, for instance, there is a significant Muslim population, but they don't have enough land. Similarly, there are, like, even when the provinces get land powers, how they are going to redistribute land. There are historically oppressed caste communities which are also landless in the north, right? So land is, like, I don't like this idea of framing land issues only through the prism of ethnicity, but we have to also bring in questions like caste and class in talking about land. But, like, there is also the singleization narrative that is also real. So NPP government should definitely, I think, address that. Like, if they really want to win the trust of the Tamil community, land is one key issue where they have to take a very strong position. So recently, there was the Kivuloya project. I think there were claims that there is a new irrigation project or, like, development project that was going to start in Mullaitivu, and they were going to bring Sinhalese from the south and settle there. But later there was a parliamentary discussion, and I heard that Minister Lalkantha had said as long as he is the Minister of Land, he wouldn't allow that to happen. They are only going to sort of, provide more infrastructure to the Sinhalese who were settled earlier and try to help their welfare, but no new Sinhalese would be brought in. But then again, I think the NPP kind of, the way NPP offers the solution is also, I think, problematic, because we are not going to do any of these things as long as we are in power. So, like, it's almost like saying the Tamils can trust us and we are not. Maybe they wouldn't do that also. I don't want to say, like, no, they are cheating or anything like that. But there is a system that they have to also create. Like, once they are not in power, who is going to ensure that, like, in these areas that Tamils and Muslims will not be minoritized further, right? So that's why I think devolving powers is very important, right? Land is that. And then language, as Professor Oyangoda said, we have laws, but again, non-implementation, right? And, like, we are spending too much money on defense budget. Why can't we hire translators, right? Why can't we use at least some money, some budgetary allocation to implement the current language policy, right? So I think these are, like, two key issues. But again, I would also say, think about local development, right? Local health sector, local agricultural activities, the cooperative sector in the north. I hear that sector is supported in some way by the current government. So, invest more in these things so that there is rural livelihood opportunities, there is, rural employment crisis could be addressed. And then, like, distribution of resources to historically marginalized communities, oppressed caste communities, Dalit communities, thinking about women and, like, how kind of, the gender justice can also be one issue, right? I don't want to sort of restrict all the reforms to ethnicity based reforms.
Right.
But I think these are things that they have to do, and they have to have a clear vision and agenda and, like, clarity about these issues. No, like, they shouldn't hesitate to speak the language that these issues require, right? Like, they shouldn't try to pacify this constituency or that constituency. Instead, be bold and introduce these changes. And I feel like, they will be, if you do the right thing, the people will support. I don't think, like, people even from the south are going to sort of say, like, this government is selling the country or like supporting terrorists or supporting the minorities or anything like that in a negative way, right? So but what I feel is that they tend to be too careful not to antagonize and fear backlash too much, and also I think lack the political will, maybe thinking that they'll have to stay in power for a longer period and shouldn't antagonize. But I think that's not going to work, and that is actually going to weaken minority communities and make their lives even more difficult. Like once they leave, who will come to power and what will happen later on is also something that people are worried about, right? So there is an opportunity. I think still we have time, right? So we have to go back to the basics, right, of left politics, right, left economic agendas, left political vision, and that is where I think we have to push the government towards. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for both. I think that's a good place to conclude. On behalf of the Med and Methana podcast, I'm very grateful to both of you, Thiru and Professor Yangoda, for taking time to be or join us today. We'll be back next week also with another discussion. Thank you everyone for listening.